decrease, the gate of contraction. The energy, the pressure, the stress to feel or not. But deeper than that, a hunger for experience. The stream of feelings moving from the 41 all the way up to the 30, the 36, and the 35. This is the abstract experiential process of humanity. It is a manifesting process, an emotional manifesting process. And it's all about experience. The 36th gate, the gate of crisis, is the gate of inexperience. The 35th gate is the gate of experience, progress. And in order for human experience to take place, it begins with all of the possibilities. All of the possibilities of human experience are stored in the 41. This is an initiator codon. It is the only start codon in our genetic code. You can imagine this as being the capital letter at the beginning of every genetic sentence. It is the capitalization, not the letter. It's a start codon. It starts everything. Now remember something, that this is a collective circuit. And because this is a collective circuit, it lives by Solomon's law. There's nothing new under the sun. In other words, it is the law that says this is the way it is, other than when mutation comes along. In other words, the 41 is the capacity to create pressure for any experience other than a mutative one. And of course, all of those experiences exist. These are just the possibilities of variations on all of these experiences. So somebody writes the Kama Sutra. This is very much a 41 process, to see how each experience has many variations, has many different kinds of experiences, in order to create a depth of historical reference about the nature of what it is to be human. This is the right angle cross of the unexpected. The 41, the 31, the 28, and the 27. It says above the lines, the limitation of resources which maximizes development of potential. This is the whole essence of decrease. The magic of the 41 is that the 41 can hold within it all the possibilities, but it can only release one at a time. That's important to see. It never pressures the 30 with all of the experiences that are possible within it to pressure. It's very specific. This is why and how the need for experience can become obsessive. Remember that the whole experiential process operates through the emotional system and through the emotional wave. And the 41st gate is an adrenal gate. It is not an awareness. And in this case, it is certainly not the wave itself. It is not the solar plex. We will see as we approach the 30th gate, the clinging fire, that the clinging fire turns the pressure into a feeling. And it is that feeling that can become obsessive. The feeling in us that we must have an experience. So the 41, the first line, reasonableness. The appropriate delegation of responsibility. And it says Neptune exalted. The imagination to make the very best out of very little. This is where when people took the sexuality course with me and I talked about the 41 being the gate of sexual fantasy, this is where all this fantasy comes from. It comes from this imagination in that sense, coolness, where the energy to release feelings is selective. Now, it's very important. This imagination, this fantasy, is to go through that whole spectrum. Think about what the adrenal system wants to do to the emotions. Think about it. The 19 flirts with the emotions. The 39 teases the emotions. And the 41 hooks them. It says, I got this great fantasy for you. Want to turn it into a feeling? And of course, the 49, the 55, and the 30, all being emotional gates, all have their way of dealing with that on and off. The 49 says to the flirt, I accept or reject you. If I accept you, stop flirting. And the 55 says to the 39, if I really accept you teasing me, then I'm going to have to stop being fickle and accept that you're really it. And the 30 gets stung by the feeling. And they get caught in the wave of the feeling. And it has no out. It just goes up and down with the feeling unless it can get rid of it and have the experience so that it can get rid of the obsession. The difference here is that the stream of feelings can never be aware. It is a purely mechanical evolutionary process. And it is not going to awaken to awareness. Mercury in detriment, a tendency and understanding to assume capability leading to strain, the hothead, the urge to release feelings. Now when it says release feelings, the urge to pressure the release of feelings. See, 41s have that potential in them for all of those experiences, but they don't have any need within themselves to fulfill it. It's not an awareness. It's just the pressure that's there. But of course, the 30, once it gets into the emotional system, it becomes part of the wave. The hope that that feeling could bring, or the pain. And remember that this is collective. And because it's collective, it's impersonal. A lot of people get hurt here. This stream is full of all kinds of human pain. Because the impersonal is taken personally. The need for experience does not mean that one loves or cares for the person you share that experience with, because this is collective and it requires sharing. The fantasy is fundamentally social and open. Everybody shares their fantasies. I mean, they do that on television, because it is collective. The process for the 41 is that intro to the first line that says the appropriate delegation, to know when to pressure the feeling. Now, if that's not awareness, and we're talking about timing, how can it possibly know? It can't. It can only be correct in its timing if you're correct in your nature. If you have the 41, if you live out your definition and your authority, and you live out your type, then that 41 is going to operate properly. And you'll have the right timing for that. You'll know when to share that fantasy to stimulate to pressurize a feeling. I have the 41st gate. I know the relationship between the 41 and the 30 so well. And I know it's the moment that you let the fantasy be possible, that the feeling is instantaneous. The moment there's this focus into one fantasy. The second line, caution. Obviously. We know the nature of second lines. We know that they are going to want to be left alone, not distracted, but at the same time that they are very vulnerable to the outside because we can all see them. Humanism tempered by pragmatism. Great word, by the way, for second lines. Be pragmatic. You know, you cannot shutter yourself off from the world forever. The hermit. You have to have those moments when you can step out and they are productive for you because they introduce you to your own potential that you may know nothing about. Remember that the second line doesn't realize its gifts. The 41-2 doesn't recognize how easy it is for it to put pressure and create feelings in others. It's my revenge on the emotional system. No, it's true. You know, some 30 comes along and hooks up my 41. It's my fantasy. It's not theirs. And if I go away, they spin in their 30 and they can't get out. Saturn exalted a conservative nature that does not risk its own security in aiding others. Remember that the 41 is a font. You know, it is a place in which the pressure is available to go through human experience. So it can be deeply attractive to the other side. But the lower trigram does not know that there's a gate at the other end. It doesn't know that. It's innocent. You know, there is no calculation being made here because it just doesn't know that. Risking its own security. You know, the moment that you are a 41 and you get pulled out into the channel, you get pulled into the wave. And of course, that's where the security is at risk. You know, the wave can be devastating. By the way, in the White Book, energy for one's own feelings, but not for others. You know, the second line in on itself, in its own fantasy. Mars in detriment, a desire for recognition that throws caution to the wind, depleting valuable resources for only temporary gain. You know, it's like flirting all the time. If you're flirting all the time, well, yeah, sure, you get, you know, your temporary moments of whatever. It's throwing it out all the time. The energy for the display of feelings for recognition. And what that really means is that they need to pressurize those feelings and experience them. The third line. Genetic traits. It's one of those things that's wonderful to watch in families and to be able to see the way that genetics operate, and then to go beyond your own blood family and look at those people that are close to you in your life and discover genetic similarities. It's one of those things that's very fascinating to me. I have the 41-3. I have the detriment of the 41-3. It's the only thing that makes me nice, if you think I'm nice. My son has a 41-3, has a Saturn there. He's got the exalted. My brother has the 41-3. Two of my nephews have the 41-3. Two of my best male friends have the 41-3. And it just pops up in my life. And you begin to see that we have extended genetic connections that go far further back than our bloodlines indicate. And that you can meet those forces just by looking at the patterns that exist in your family and then looking at the people around you. It's very interesting to see. So the 41-3 efficiency. In times of decrease, selfishness is justified. What that's really saying is that one has to be careful about what kind of feelings one stimulates. And the reality is that the third line, of course, keeps bumping into feelings. I mean, that's what happens to them. They keep on bumping into the 30. I mean, they're not looking for the 30. They don't know particularly that the 30 is there, but because it's a third line, they're beginning this process of moving towards the transpersonal, and so they keep on banging into the other. Bonds made and broken, trial and error as their process. The Saturn exalted material ambition and the discipline to go it alone. You should see how fast my son puts his hand in my pocket. I mean, you know, that hunger that's there. You know, they can be very efficient at that. Material ambition, to create desire on the material plane. In other words, to move away as quickly as possible from the sexual values, which are always inherent in this stream, always, you can never escape it here, because it is a major part of the human experience, and it is a major part of our collective process because we begin with the pair bond and move outward. So it has a great deal to do with our erotic, our sexual lives. At the same time, obviously, it has a mundane application. This material ambition in the third line is that the feeling for the material plane often is much more productive. You know, you end up with the jack of all trades. You end up with somebody that can make their way in the world through experience in many different things. The energy that fuels the feeling for personal ambition. There are always dualities and there are always mirrors. You know, the mirror of the 41 is the 58. You know, there it is fueling the challenge to authority. And here in the 41, it's fueling the challenge of hunger and inexperience. The detriment, moon in detriment, instinctive assistance admirable, but in this position misguided, where two will use up resources twice as fast as one. The energy that fuels the feeling to share. It's a good thing that I have an undefined root and I don't trust all that. However, you know, for somebody who's so individual as I am, you know, people talk about detriments being bad. You know, here's a detriment that actually makes me social. Without that detriment, I probably could not get involved in all that I have to do in this life. Terrible detriment. The upper trigram. You know, you have now a different kind of process. Always remember that when you're dealing with the collective and you have lower trigram, there's a real difficulty in operating successfully in terms of being able to share properly. There is the uncertainty about the other. There is the unknowing of the other. And as a result, there is no real way, other than if they're aware and they're aware of their own nature, there's no real way to protect them. On the other hand, when you're dealing with the upper trigram, because it's already transpersonal by nature, and it's in this most social of circuitry, that you know that the upper trigram is deeply aware that there is this 30th gate at the other end, and that's where the feelings are. It knows that. And so its process is entirely different. Rather than being concerned with the fantasy as such, it's concerned with the other and whether and how it can get the other to be in its game, to join in and fulfill the experience. The fourth line is called correction. Successful adaptation to limitation. The survival of the fittest and its eventual flourishing. Earth, that's the earth exalted. The survival of the fittest. By the way, you'll notice that because that's the earth in this position, that of course it's part of incarnation theme. Survival of the fittest and its eventual flourishing. The energy for adaptation and a deep feeling for survival. These people are very, very good at externalizing their fantasy, their thing, and externalizing it when they have their opportunity, because they know they have the right 30 at the other end who can turn that into a feeling. Because without that, there is insufficient power to be able to get to the point where one is ready to actually jump into the experience rather than just go through the feeling. Remember, there's two stages to experience. The build-up, the feeling itself, and then the experience. But like sexuality, the build-up carries much more power than the climax, because the climax, it's over. It's just over. So the deep process that is involved in any kind of human experience operates at the feeling level first, and at a deep level of feeling, because it's emotional. The feeling that you can, and the feeling that you can't, the feeling that you will, the feeling that you will never. You go through the whole wave associated with whatever that experience is that the feeling is directed at. Venus in detriment. The expenditure of energy on maintaining relationships rather than on correction. In times of decrease, weak associations are shunned as costly no matter how attractive. Now remember the dilemma of the fourth line. It is inherently friendly. I mean, after all, that's the way in which it gets to externalize, is that it has a gift for friendship in terms of how it becomes intimate with you. And that friendship is always the basis of opportunity, whether that opportunity is material or sexual. So the reality is that what can happen is, because you need the 30 and you need that relationship, that instead of really being able to get out what your hunger needs to have fulfilled, you tend to placate your friend instead. In other words, you get carried away by their feeling, and that you have to continue to fuel their feeling and not your own. Now, of course, that's all a learning process. The externalization of fantasy, after all. When you get to the last 7 minutes and 30 seconds of the fourth line, the cross changes and the 27, 28 disappear. By the way, something to note. The fourth line, the majority of this fourth line as a cross, holds within it the 28-6, blaze of glory. And it's one of those things to see, is that the whole business of stimulating feeling can always lead to self-destruction. You know, one of the most difficult things is to be clear about how feelings must manifest. I mean, this is very, very important. This is not about controlling emotional systems. Feelings have to get out, but of course they have to get out according to the nature and to the type. Otherwise, there's always this opportunity there to really burn out. In the juxtaposition cross, however, the 27 and 28 are replaced by the 24 and the 44. Two gates of the gate of the cross of the four ways. And you have 41, 31, 44, 24. This is the cross of fantasy. And these people are going to be fixed on stimulating others with fantasy, turning them on. Remember that this is a desire gate. That is, desire is the theme of this stream, as passion is the theme of individuality, as need is the theme of the tribe. The left angle cross is called the left angle cross of the Alpha. And as we know, the Alpha, we see this mostly in animal populations, that the Alpha is the lead animal. The one that's considered to be top dog. I think that's the expression, at least amongst the dogs. It's interesting to note that the four gates of this cross of the Alpha, the 41, this beginning of all possibilities in the experiential way, the 31, the gate of influence, the 44, one of the ways coming to meet, and the 24, the return. These are different ways in which we are guided. The fifth line is called authorization. The external recognition of one's potential despite limitations. You notice the language. The external recognition. Here's the classic example of the fifth line general heretic. You know, it's the external recognition that comes. They're the source of that energy. They have within them the necessary energy for us to enter into our experience. Remember, from the 30s perspective, the 41 is an ice cream shop, and they're just looking for the right flavor, and not particularly caring about the 41 in that sense. Mars exalted, the value of energy when properly channeled. The fuel for properly channeled feelings despite limitations. I've had a lot of people ask me if that's about channeling. And I always say everything's about channeling. This is a channel system. I'll never forget going to Sedona, I think the first time with Chaitanya. We pulled up in the afternoon for some bizarre introductory lecture. And there was a woman afterwards who said to me, she walked up to me and she said, I channeled too. And I said, I'm not channeled too. Now, Venus in detriment. A persistent dissatisfaction with limitation which hampers development even when supported. Limitations initiate the fuel for negative feelings. Everything about the 41.5 is about the pressure that comes from the outside. It's extreme. That is, that the outside or society recognizes and projects onto the 41.5 that out of its resource, any experience can be possible. That doesn't mean that the 41.5 is actually equipped to fulfill that projection. No fifth line is guaranteed to be able to fulfill the projection that's placed on it by the society. So, of course, that can bring a lot of difficulties. The key for all fifth lines is to build their power by not using it. To wait. To let the pressure build. To wait for the time of crisis, and to wait for the pressure that is practical that initiates the practical feeling, if such a thing is possible, in order for that experience to be something that is potentially healthy. The sixth line is called contagion. The 41.6, from its perspective, it goes through the third line stage. It goes through, being driven by its own need for its own feelings and being caught up in the need of the feelings of others. And it recognizes the price you pay for desire, because it's all about desire. So when you look at a 41.6, you can look at a being after the early part of its life that seems desireless, aloof from the desire field, but still able to confirm out of its very nature the possibility of an experience. If you ask a 41.6 if it's possible to do something that is only possible through mutation, it will tell you you can't do it. Remember that. It's collective. And in being collective, it's limited as a possibility for human experience. Will always be. No, you can't do that. Nobody can fly. The law that the maximization of potential not only ends decrease, but inevitably such transcendence benefits others. At the point that you can really see what experience deserves to be stimulated. That what feeling will not turn out to be damaging. All of that is sitting there in the 41.6, and they are very contagious. This whole business about the 6 being able to say to the village, this is the right solution for you, and everybody in the village goes along with that because it's contagious. By the way, it doesn't mean that the 6 is right. That's always important to keep in mind. Remember, the dilemma of all 6 lines is that unlike the 4th line and the 5th line, whose transpersonal gifts are limited to knowing that there is a gate, a harmonic gate at the other end of the channel, that in the 6th line, that the whole circuitry is being viewed. And what that means is that the only experience worth being obsessed over is an experience ultimately that benefits humanity and will be significant enough to be stored as historical material. That's quite a thing. That is a long view. And there are so many steps between the 41 and the ultimate revelation that's possible in the 33. And it's a long way from the 41 if the 29 has not made the right commitment. And the 46 accepts that it's in exactly the right place at the right time. And so forth and so on. And that abstract mind is able to take in that experience existentially and to be able to bring it back conceptualized as an idea about what it means to have that feeling and that experience and its value to other humans. And it's not like the 41.6 is a genius and can figure all that out. It's just a dumb adrenaline system. So there is a resistance in the 41.6, like in all 6 lines, to stand up above the fray and look at all of that and say, oh, well, yeah, sure. It's okay to crank up your feelings, but where is that going to take us? What's the point of going through the next stage of crisis and then finally getting to the end of it, only to realize that once it's over, it's like Chinese food, you're hungry again. There's a lot of pointlessness in the abstract way because it's necessary to fill out all of the different variations. Pluto in detriment. The tendency in transcendence to keep it a secret, in fear of being deprived of its special advantages. The fuel for secret or repressed feelings. Now, by the way, what that simply means is that in their early part of their life, they kept on banging into others, and they discovered that it wasn't a very, very good thing for them necessarily to reveal what they're pressuring for, what their fantasy is. And because they don't find forces that are correct for them at the other end, they end up withdrawing and they hold those things within them, as they do anyway. It's simply about getting to the point where the pressure is being held back. Now remember something, everything about the abstract process is cyclical. So it can only hold it back so long because it's cyclical. Ultimately, it will have to release that pressure. When it's clear enough about what pressure is necessary to fulfill its hunger, the next step is that it goes to the 19th gate. It goes into the tribe. It's still in the root pointed towards the emotional system. And we've gone from desire to need. In other words, is this desire something that one truly needs? It's a very, very different thing. It is a conditioning on the quality of desire. Now, of course, that's not very effective in life. Remember, there's no awareness in it. But in the 19, there is a recognition that the relationship to the emotional system must be based on need. And that need is the need for resources. I mean, think about that. The 41's hungry, but the 19 is interested in having a pasture full of sheep. Then the question of hunger disappears, sort of. As we'll see.